So we see that this new receptor at the retina has a significant ability to control our hormone level in the blood. Not having said that other wavelengths do not contribute, and this is why Joachim argues we need to determine the response at all 4 receptors, all 5 receptors. But melanopsin is the main responsible for this. Melatonin is the most important hormone that controls our immune system. And there is a consensus these days that melatonin plays a very vital role in the fight for cancer. It is also an antioxidant that neutralizes free radicals like cancer. It also activates other vitamins such as C and E vitamin. It stimulates other antioxidants in our immune system. And finally, it activates our immune system in the white blood cells. So it also fights infection. So this is the reason that when Joachim tells you, you need also to take into account the response for the melanopsin receptors. This is because this is extremely important for our health. So 5 years ago, we were contacted by Team Denmark, and they asked us, could you help us to make light for our swim team in Rio? They need to have a very, very good sleep during the night, because we know sleep is important for the performance. They also need to adapt to the local time in Brazil, that is 5 hours from our time zone in Denmark. And then you need to adapt this circadian cycle so that they perform in the best way when they are at competition. That was actually during the night or during the evening. So we made some lighting. So they began already before the travel to Rio. We have at the hotels made special lighting so that they could have this clock in the morning reset in a proper way, also we made a lot of studies on the individual swimmers, how we could design the lighting so that they could react much faster. And this is the quality of sleep is important, and then the reaction time is important. And this is just one of the examples. So we had this light box, and then we used a different design, and actually the swimmers should, in this case, should be activated a sound, and then she should hit a button on the computer in order to react as fast as possible. And this was done during the illumination. And in addition to this circadian lighting, just before people were in competition, we made a light treatment for the swimmers that was optimized to make them react faster. And at that time, this is Pernille Blume. She actually got a gold medal at the Olympics in Rio. She was a little skeptic in the beginning, but then she saw Jeanette Olsen and all the others were using this, so she started also to use this light treatment. And as you know, the competition is rather tough for swimmers. So this is actually the picture of Pernille Blume when she won the gold medal. In this moment, and you see, this is her competitors here. And you tend to believe, oh, this must be number 2 and 3. No, actually, this was number 5 and 6 in the competition. So this reaction time improvement was extremely important for these swimmers. And what we were able to do was, as you saw on the slide, was to improve the reaction time between 20 milliseconds and 30 milliseconds. And if you look into 30 milliseconds, then you're not in the podium. Then I would like to discuss another aspect of circadian lighting. And this is what I believe is very important for all of us. And this is the light that we have when we are just born. And this is important, and it is likely to influence us the rest of the life. The right environments can help newborn to improve the circadian cycle, to reduce stress hormones, to improve the growth, and to make premature babies sleep better during the night. And at hospitals, you have a very tough lighting condition, very open, where when you're looking at children, they simply do not open their eyes. And especially the light during the night is extremely important for these premature babies. And we have made some kind of recommendation for premature babies, and this is that lighting should be adjusted individual to each child. Intense light should be avoided. Bright light can be damaging for the visual system. Daylight is also extremely important for newborn. So if they are close to the window, it is beneficial. Also, the lighting that you're using should have high color rendering, and then it should be without flicker that you have in many systems today, unfortunately. And then you should use the light to stimulate the growth of hormone. And even though I know that it is important to have visual inspection of children, the light should be as low as possible during the night.
As a lighting designer, we now have to work with the visual. I think I have a pointer. You can see my pointer. The visual requirement, which we know from a long time. We have standard, we have functional tasks that we have to fulfill visually. And we also work to create a special atmosphere. We know all of that. We know the measurements, we have the standards. And then there's the non-visual needs that we try to fulfill. And despite your very good explanations, it's not so easy to do it in reality because first of all, it's new to put it into building programs. So I see like a struggle to put quantitative demands and so the way the building industry works, we can sometimes, even though building program asks for circadian lighting, we can sometimes just have a downlight that's dimmed at night because we need like quantitative or very clear description of what the client want. Otherwise, because we're competing also in economy. So this is a new task to get that into the building industry. The good thing is, and great thanks to people like Joachim who's so patient in insisting in telling lighting designers what we should do, but show that it's actually not that hard to calculate the non-visual lighting, if you can say so. We have this guy who's reading at daytime. You have 2,600 lux at the eye at corner here, and we can take from the standard, the CE standard, the D65 light source, and transform or recalculate that into alpha opic responses. And at the same time, we can see, or we measured 1,000 lux in the book pages, which is sufficient for reading. And this is at daytime. At nighttime, you have, I have to move myself. You have 6 lux at the eye, and we know the light source, so we can calculate that also. And you have 500 lux on the book, which is sufficient for reading. So the only new thing to lighting designers is that you have to calculate on the eye rather than on the task. And we have to use the standards to calculate that into circadian stimuli. I wonder if the D65 is good in all cases. And this is a picture from blocks. And you can see, this is kind of the visual. We can open a little window and we see the sky, the real sky there. And you see the sky through the window there. And it's an old discussion, but still I'd like someone to do more research into what does it mean to us that the weather looks bad, even though it's not. It's an old discussion, but it's a problem that we don't have anything but the light transmittance to assess or put demands on windows. So I was wondering, like, the window works as a filter, and I was wondering if that have an influence on the non-visual effects of light. And so Joachim and I, we took 6 different windows and measured with Joachim's brilliant system the lux level through the window, these 6 different windows, the correlated color temperature in Kelvin, and all the 5 alpha opic EDIs. And it looks like that. And it's just a quick Friday afternoon. That's the way we have our Friday bar. We stand and measure light. But we measure daylight before and after. Of course, daylight is changing. As an architect, I would say that's the quality of daylight. But when calculating, it was a little bit troublesome. So we measured daylight before and daylight after. There you have the light transmittance of the different windows, and you have the luxes. And there's a good correlation between, like, the window with the 30% light transmissions only let approximately 30% light through. Then we have the Kelvin, which is different from all of them, but it just reveals that the same thing, which is a huge misunderstanding into electrical lighting, that you can't use Kelvin for anything whatsoever. I mean, this is like, it goes cooler, but it have a lower alpha opic EDEs. And then from just this quick little experiment, it seems like there's a fairly good correlation between the lux levels that's let through the window and the different responses. But I think there's a PhD in studying this further. And as a lighting designer, it's really important that we now have a CIE standard, so we know that it's just not our feeling, but we have something real to calculate with. Usually when we do daylight calculations, we just, we have different systems, but it's always on a horizontal level. And that is, of course, a new demand that both for visual, but also especially for non-visual effects. I mean, we don't live in a plan 80 centimeter above floor. we see everything virtual, and it's the virtual surfaces that influences the light that we receive at the eye. So that's the biggest change, that we have to calculate vertically. But if we have offices like this, it will be no trouble whatsoever to calculate the lux level with the right light transmission of the window at the workplace. However, this we do is, of course, to standard, so it's all workplaces in spaces that have workplaces and in living facilities. But as an average, maybe to better meet the non-visual needs, we should start to think of differentiated buildings, so that we rather have like the bay window, or in an elderly house, a special corner where you have a lot of light and your favorite armchair, or you have rooftop terrace, and easy access to well-designed outdoor spaces, so that people easily can get out, encouraged to get out, and we have different spaces, because no one really sits like on a computer all day from 8 to 5. Usually we move around, we go to meetings, so I would argue that architecture would benefit from being more differentiated than the standard encouraged right now, and that would go into the building programs. Maybe we can look into the early modern architecture where this is before Penicillium, so it was like Altos Sanatorium, where they treated tuberculosis with sunlight. And I think they had a lot of virtues and a lot of very good idea that we might look up again and reuse. And if I move from daylight to the light-darkness circle, we have twilight, which I think is particularly important in the Nordic countries. It's so rich, it's so beautiful, I think, in the Nordic countries. And we used to celebrate that as a moment of complementation, to keep skumringstime, for those of you who speak Danish. That was when you gathered and thought about the day, or had a story told. And I think that was a nice tradition that we forgot because we're so efficient. And once you get into this, there's really a big difference from this golden hours where the sun is 6 degrees above the horizon, to sunset, to this blue hours. Those of you who take pictures should shoot them exactly at the blue hour where the sun is 4 degrees below the sky. And then the nautical twilight where it gets darker, but you can still see in summertime, the Scandinavian summertime, we only reach there. We never reach the astronomical really dark night. Once you get your eyes into the twilight, it's so rich. I did that, and for aesthetical reasons only. This is Swego's head office, and outside, and I used to sit here, and outside there's a metro. And so at daytime, we have a daylight responsive dimming system. That means like you need to have 500 lux here, and the light in the ceiling dims according to the amount of daylight. So you have a constant level. That, of course, is sad when you think like the quality of daylight is that it changes, but this is the way we build. But then after dark, the electrical lighting is usually at its full. And that means when you sit there, you can only see your own mirror in the ceiling, in the window, because it's dark outside, until you one of a sudden have a metro train in front of you. And that's a scary experience. And also Svego is situated in a very beautiful place. So it's a so beautiful view out of the skyline of Copenhagen, but you can only see yourself. So what I propose is that we have a twilight scenario, and it does require more than ceiling light. I would like the task light and a special light. In this case, it could be the wall was that we put into the walkway. That to be on a constant level to kind of reveal the changing color tones and light levels of the twilight, and then dim down the general lighting in the ceiling in order to perceive and sense twilight. This is made purely, I admit, for aesthetic reasons, but I think that would be healthy as well, and it would save energy.
So Tord has given you an overview of the BrainLit's biocentric lighting system, and I will show you some of our case studies using the system. So please, next slide. What you've heard today is probably, you know, most of the things that I have on the slide here, but just a quick recap. There is a lot of things happening in the body and in the brain when we're exposed to light. We get an increased heart rate, we get pupillary constriction, increased skin conductance, melatonin suppression, of course, and increased EEG activity. And this is very elegantly showed by colleagues Van der Waal, where they did MRI experiments. And it's so fascinating that things are happening in our brain just within seconds. And after a minute or so, we also get activities in the brainstem, for example, and in the limbic system, which we are very well know is important for our emotions. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of this earlier today from the presentation of Professor Foster. And if we have prolonged light exposure, we also can see activities in different areas in the cortex of the brain. And the interesting part is that these activities is modulated by light. So certain lighting and certain wavelengths give a certain amount of activity, and whereas other wavelengths don't. So we have these direct effects of light, and I will show you one study that we are using this effect for learning. And the previous slide also mentioned the long-term effect, which are the circadian effect. And I will have 2 cases regarding that. So next slide, please. So our first study here is in a school in Malmö. So we had 2 classrooms, one with a conventional lighting, and you see it's on the upper left corner, and you see the spectral power distribution there. So it's a fluorescent lighting system. And on the other slide, on the other picture, you can see the LED light, and you can see that it varies during the day. So next slide, please. This was 13 years old in one group, in one classroom, and we had 13-year-olds in the other group, and they were followed for 2 weeks. They had pretty much the same activity, and the distribution between male and female were pretty much the same between the 2 groups. They had a little bit more snacking in the intervention group, a little bit more screen exposure, but otherwise they were quite similar. And in the conventional classroom, the light was static the whole week, whereas in the intervention classroom, the light was shifting. So in the morning, it was a little bit warmer, and quite early it started with activating light, full intensity and a high color temperature. At lunch, a little bit more neutral, and then after lunch, the boosting effect with more intensity and higher color temperature. Whereas at the end of the day, it became warmer and less intense. So next slide, please. The interesting part with the lighting systems here is that you can calculate the impact of the light, and I'm sure you're very much aware of this, and there are different ways of doing this. Here we use the system by Ree and colleagues at Lighting Research Center, where they use the circadian stimulus, circadian light, where this is a way of calibrating the spectral power distribution of light and the intensity, and see how much that could give a circadian impact. So if you have a circadian stimulus of 0.5, for example, this is matching a 50% reduction of melatonin at night if you're exposed for 1 hour. So if we look at the control light situation, we had a circadian stimulus of 0.42, and for the intervention light, the first week, the light was static, and then the circadian stimulus there were around 0.48. And when we turned it on to the dynamic light, so in the morning hours, we had the circadian stimulus of around 0.48. So there was a little bit more difference there. And below, to the left, you can see the different intensity levels. The superior one is the first week when the light was excuse me, static, and the below one is when it was dynamic. So what could we see? Well, we followed the sleep efficiency, and the sleep efficiency had a tendency to be more efficient for the intervention group compared to the control group, but it wasn't significant. But we could see a significant effect on the number of awakenings, and this was especially so for the second week when the light was turned on to a dynamic one as compared to the static one. And another thing we can note here is that it's fairly high circadian stimulus levels in both classrooms, actually, and intensity levels of over 500-600. It's not that common in classrooms, so it was a good situation already from the beginning, I'd say. Okay, so next slide, please. So that was the school. We also have installed the lighting in an elderly care center. And here the changes were made in the corridors, in the general living room, and in the dining room. And the elderly were followed from September, and there were also measurements made in December and in March. And we can take the next slide, please. So what we could see here was that there were less awakenings in the experimental group, awakenings at night in the experimental group compared to the control group. And what is more important, if you look at the screens below, the number of the percent of incidents for fall were lower among the experimental group compared to the control group. And that there seems to be a seasonal effect such that the importance of the lighting is most important during the darker months, you can see regarding the seasonal alertness. So during the spring and the early autumn, there were not that big difference between the control and experimental group, whereas in the dark months of December, you had more alertness in the experimental group compared to the control group. Well, you can go back to the other slide, because this was for the elderly. We also made measurements for the staff, because there is also staff that get the light when they are working there. And in many times there are a lot of not elderly, but women that are middle-aged, and in this case the staff were that kind of staff, so they were women, middle-aged, that had a lot of problem with dry eyes. So we also asked them regarding dry eye symptoms, and using a validated questionnaire for that, we could see a difference from before the installation and after the installation, and that there could be a connection there. It's not that far-fetched, because if you look at dry eye symptoms, they are very much connected to sleep. So if you have a bad sleep, you have more dry eye symptoms. And there is also a connection between dry eye symptoms and depression. And depression and sleep are very much linked. So they are sort of linked together, all these three. And for depression, we know that light is very important. And for sleep, we also know that light is very important. So the question is there a light effect regarding dry eye symptoms? Well, if we look, I think this is quite interesting since I'm an ophthalmologist. So if you look at dry eye symptoms, there is actually a circadian effect in the eye production of a tear liquid, for example. There is also a circadian effect of the epithelium and so on. And in dogs, they have made measurements of the tear production and correlated that to light stimulation. So they could affect the production of tear liquid with light. So that was our question also. Could we have an effect with this improved lighting? And indeed, we did see effect on the dry eye symptoms, such that after the light had changed, they had much less symptoms of that. So unfortunately, I don't have a slide on that. Okay, so next slide, please. So these two examples we showed before were the circadian effects. And here we are more looking into the cognitive aspects. And there are some studies before showing that, for example, Alcocer have shown that if you have a memory training and then you're exposed to a blue light for half an hour, and then you wait and the recall, they could see that they had an improvement if you were exposed to blue light compared to amber light. So in this study, it was done in Copenhagen, in Byens Skole. They had 4th and 5th graders in this study, and they installed the biocentric lighting system in 4 of the classrooms where the students, where the pupils had their lessons. And for the static light, they had 3,000 Kelvin and 450 lux for the static one. And for the dynamic one, they started off with 4,500 Kelvin, which increased to 5,500 Kelvin during the day, and a little bit more intense with 750 lux. And this was made also in combination with a ventilation change. So they had a crossover. So first they had a change of the lighting for 1 week for one group, and the other group acted as a control. And the next week they reversed the lighting to the static one for the other group, and the other group had the intervention. And after another week they changed the ventilation, and then did the same crossover with the lighting for the 2 groups. So next slide, please. So what they did was also, during these weeks, they had the pupils do 3 different tasks. They had one mathematic task where they had to solve equation with multiplication and subtraction for 8 minutes. And they also had a concentration task called the D2 task, which is the one on the top left, where you have all these P's and D's with a lot of dots over and under. You have to mark the D's just with 2 dots over or 2 dots under. So it's a measurement of the concentration effect. And the third thing they did was a Bradley test, where you sort of have to find if a triangle is fitted into a circle or not, and you have to answer that. So, and what they saw was that for the D2 test, which is the concentration test, if you change the ventilation and the lighting, you had an improvement of the result of about 8% compared to the control. And that was not depending on which one you change first. But for the interesting enough for the mathematic part, if you made the changement of lighting first, then the changement of the ventilation didn't have any extra effects. So changing lighting by itself improved the results with 12%. And we think this might be an effect of this activating light that we see here.
Thank you so much. So and to moderate this debate here, coming to a close after a long and very knowledgeable and intense day. So Professor Russell, Foster, you can hear me?
I can, yep.
Marete Madsen out there in Mo, you can hear me also?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. I'm the guy without any hair and weird glasses, so I'll put the camera over.
I'll join you.
So allow me to focus on the role of healthy buildings, being that offices, schools, restaurants, home, private housing, of course, education, hotels, etc., as we have heard and seen throughout the day. And I just gave it a thought because being, as I said, a non-subject matter expert, I am a customer. I do drive and have the responsibility as the CEO of quite a large co-working space in downtown Copenhagen, blocks up where luckily Ocutune and Daniel and Joachim are residing. We have some 700 people coming and going every day. And imagine that I could reach out to my residents, my customers, saying, hey, if you come to Blocks Up, you will have the most healthy building ever seen. You will have a building which has been designed from the beginning with circadian lighting. We can actually offer you a co-working space with circadian lighting. That would be a tremendous market positioning tool for me as one providing leases and offices and desks for people within the urban environment. And I think what I would like to focus on in the discussion here coming to a close would be that kind of focus. How can we drive forward this movement, so to speak? How can we take the very hardcore scientific evidences that we have heard throughout the day and then push through a market demand, imagining a future where it is inevitable that any building, any household, any office space offers circadian lighting as a standard, of course. Imagine a recruitment situation where you sit in front of an employee potentially being recruited, and the recruit says, do you have circadian lighting in here? And you say no. And he says, well, I'm out of the office. I'll go to the competitor next door. Imagine a situation like this. So how can we come to that situation? I think we would like to add to the very scientific discussion, having been on board today, this issue of how can we create this market demand. I think it would be interesting to turn to you, Professor Foster, to hear a little bit about, I know, of course, you come from a very scientific standpoint, but could you enlighten us a little bit about what are sort of the points of view and the status of the British construction industry, the British building clients, and for that matter, both public and private clients? Are they demanding circadian lighting to the extent that you think you are there already? Or how far are we away from this desired future that I sketched out? Would you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the British situation is very mixed. So at one end you have the very distinguished architect Ian Ritchie, who is integrating light into everything that he does. In fact, his great inspiration was the Crystal Palace, that extraordinary building of 1851, and bringing as much light into the spaces. At the other end, there's, I think, minimal interest, and so I think it's a matter of education. And I think the point that you made is that we've got to get the clients to start asking that question. How is this building adapted to optimize performance and circadian and sleep biology using light, either natural light or artificial light?
Marete, you have close dialogue with Danish, primarily Danish building clients, and you talked about the value or the content of the building programs desiring and demanding this. What are your experience on this, and what are your suggestions to push forward this movement?
My experience is there's a growing interest, especially in elderly people's houses, for some in schools as well, even though I think kids should get out in the breaks and not sit in artificial light. So there's a growing interest, but a lack of how to describe it so that we can actually compete in it. That's what, so we have to help the client as well so they get what they want. But then I would just say daylight, because daylight is, I mean, we treat daylight as the cheapest gum. Maybe because there's few people who's selling daylight, and we can improve tremendously.
We are at a point now where we see new ways of measuring. We see new lighting systems that can be integrated. We see new ways of measuring daylight, glass, more glass. We see how these things are interacted with each other. So I also think that there's a lot of technology coming to the market now that can actually help us navigate much better in these light environments and give us insight.
Talk.
I would like to emphasize that setting a new standard means that there has to be an agreement. It's like, setting a new infrastructure, which you can compete on all the other services, which is based on that infrastructure. And I think when it comes to what we just are discussing, we have a number of pillars which we need to make sure that they are open. So we should have agree on some open interfaces, some specifications, of course, how we measure things. And so we have some number of pillars which we have to agree on in order to really make it possible to compete on the other things. So it's very much in the line of discussing with all the stakeholders, I think, in this industry. We need to, of course, have a base on evidence-based technology. We have to build on science and knowledge from the science. It's extremely important. So I think the marketing around what healthy light actually is very important.
Just to follow up on that, and then the other thing I think is which is important, as we mentioned earlier, is that when we are doing these circadian lighting or integrative lighting designs, we should afterwards evaluate them, what worked, what didn't, and learn from that. And then we should also be much better at showcasing the really, really good solutions out there, whether being daylight, whether it being integrative lighting systems, dynamic lighting systems.
Implementing healthy lighting in schools, in elderly homes, at university, in offices is, of course, something very, very important for the future. I think that we are doing it, unfortunately, in a very little systematic way, and that we could improve further. And very often it is implemented without any evidence. And the consumer, the people buying the circadian rhythm should ask for test. We now have a CRE toolbox that can give us the information needed in order to determine the impact on our health. And people should really ask for this test. And this is the way that we can implement the knowledge that has been built up at universities, research in institutions. And in the final end, it will be beneficial for the health of the people working in these buildings.
But how do we convince the building industry, and namely the buyers of the building industry services, that this is a no-brainer? This has to be done in order to create the future I was briefly describing earlier on. Do we have the right tools? You point to some direction, but are we good enough in translating the scientific results onto, for example, Marete Madsen and Mo as the consultants, having the very close dialogue to the clients, paying for the services and getting the value out of proper air, proper sound, proper lighting, etc. maybe that is a question posed to you, Marete. Are you sufficiently informed scientifically in order for you to have this dialogue with the client in order to convince the client in the right direction?
We can see a lot happened in just 2 years, and that's a short time in building industry. I mean, it takes many years from the program is written to the building is there. So of course, all the knowledge is new, but now all the tools is there, so there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do it. And costs is a very abstract phenomenon in building industry, because if you know from the beginning what you want, it tends to be not as expensive as if you come after. So I think it's a matter of being clear what you want with the evidence. And then also I feel like saying with a respect for everything is united. That's why I showed like united sustainability goals, because it has to be sustainable. We can't use that much energy on electrical light. You might have a new young person who said, I don't want to live in or work in your building unless you tell me how you fulfill the sustainability goals. Lighting design needs to be integrated. I wonder if there's a correlation between 60 by 60 ceiling luminaires and depression, or it's just me who feel like that. Because we have such a rich tradition, and why shouldn't I have like a shelf lamp with the quality of an old-fashioned dimmed incandescent lamp? We have such a rich tradition that can't be thrown away with water. Just so it's not enough to have evidence and light. It needs to be beautiful. It needs to be lighting design. And you need to have on uniformity. You need to have light zones, because right now it's 60 by 60 in the ceiling. It's so uniform that I would have a depression. So I think it needs to integrate all disciplines.
Foster, are those your experiences as well, or
Yeah, I think I am optimistic, because what the broader public are interested in is a better understanding from the scientific community and science communicators about the importance of sleep and the importance of circadian rhythms. And that's now beginning to influence their decisions about their health. And of course, to get better sleep, to get better regulation of circadian rhythms, you need to live in spaces which optimize that. And so I think there's going to be a broadening of education generally, with people sort of fascinated with clocks and sleep. They're also going to look at the buildings in which they live, and start to want more than just a lamp which allows you to read sufficiently.
So I think another thing that's been quite interesting to watch, actually, this has been described very adequately by Matthew Walker, is the fact that we are starting to see companies that are basically wanting to become sleep intelligent companies. And this is not because they just want good lighting. This is actually because they can see that this is something that is not only their working environment of their employees, but also their earnings. And if you go to Matthew Walker, as he mentioned, 4 out of 5 key performance indicators that you basically calculate on is being smashed by insufficient sleep. But we're not measuring on sleep in our companies. Why is this? And then the other thing that I think is quite interesting is, I think that I would say spearheaded by Professor Russell's group in Oxford, finding these cells. It's a sky detector. It's something that has been with us for 400 million years. It tells us the importance of daylight and the daylight pattern. So I think it opens up to both architects and manufacturing designers to provide good light.
Ken Wright did some wonderful experiments, compared the sleep-wake timing of a group of university students. And he looked at their light exposure in their normal domestic environment. And then he took them camping in the in the Colorado mountains for a week, and they just had effectively natural light. And what was so fascinating is that the increased morning light that those individuals received advanced their biological clocks and their sleep-wake cycle by approximately, I think it was something like 2 hours. And, you know, that was in just 1 week. And so when people say, I'm glad you asked me that, Joachim, because when people say, well, what evidence do we have that natural light can make any difference? Well, Ken Wright's study has shown that, I think, very, very convincingly.
I just get the impression that listening to you both earlier today and also here in the discussion, that the scientific evidence is there. There's no question of it. It's a no-brainer to some extent, to a large extent, I would say. And
I think we have enough information now to start to make some evidence-based approaches. We don't have all the answers yet because it's a very dynamic situation. But I do think we have enough to start to integrate the science into practical solutions for building design. One thing I would also add, which I think is important, is in addition to, of course, the appropriate light to regulate alertness, the sleep-wake cycles, circadian rhythms, we should probably also think about vitamin D synthesis. There's increasing evidence that vitamin D is very important for the immune system and immune function and other aspects of health. And of course, exposure to UVB, even during part of the day within the domestic or commercial environment, I think will be very important as well. And of course, most glass, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, actually blocks out UVB and therefore our capacity to synthesize vitamin D.
so what about building requirements, building regulations? Are they up to speed? Would you think we've seen it in energy renovation? We've seen it within digitalization of the construction industry. More and more requirements coming from the public client. In sort of a reformulated building regulation on this area also, Marete?
No, I don't think the building regulation is up to date. No, it's very old-fashioned.
Okay, I agree. I'm a resident in.
We all agree.
People think that is the most sustainable building in the world, and as you just showed earlier with your case study and together with Joachim, it is not.
Yeah, I just would like to support the statement from Russell Foster about the importance of D vitamins in the building.
Of
D vitamin,
yes,
for people living indoor. And we have made a study actually together with Cardiff Wolf that is here today in the audience about different types of windows. And it turns out that most of them actually block the wavelength that is used for D vitamin production. And the optimum wavelength for the D vitamin production is 296 nanometer, as Professor Russell stated in UVB. But we can implement these glasses in our window without iron that transmit this very important radiation that improve the production of D vitamin in old people, and this is especially important for elderly people to have this kind of D vitamin.
Yeah, and of course, postmenopausal women who constitute a very large part of the workforce because of the changed hormonal levels, and of course, bone density and vitamin D, of course, is critically important for that.
Hi, my name is Shaida. I'm from Paladin Architects. What I'm looking at the moment is we are talking a lot about circadian rhythm and the daylight, but what are we doing for the shift workers? I think Russell touched a little bit on that, but what are we doing to minimize the impact of this circadian rhythm disruption for shift workers? Okay. And how can they go back and still have a life and sleep well? And other than the healthcare industry, there's not much other studies that is being done on other night shift workers.
Yeah, I mean, I've just published a review paper, which I'm very happy to circulate, which deals with what we can do as individuals to enhance our sleep and circadian rhythms, but also what an employer should do as a duty of care for their night shift employees, or indeed other sectors of the community who are suffering from sleep disruption. I think it's an incredibly important question. I think we're not going to get rid of the effects of shift work, but we could mitigate. So knowing that metabolic abnormalities, obesity, diabetes 2 is higher in night shift workers compared to day shift workers, then what type of nutrition are we providing for the night shift workers? It's high fat, it's high sugar. And why nobody has actually bothered to develop a protein-rich snack that would sustain a night shift worker over the night is beyond me. And of course, a study fairly recently showed that 57% of junior doctors had either had a crash or a near miss on the drive home after the night shift. So why aren't we giving these individuals simple vigilance devices they can put on the dashboard and will detect head nod and alert them they're falling asleep? And so I think there's a lot we can do to mitigate. But of course, we're still going to have some fundamental problems, because essentially the biology of the night shift worker is all aligned for sleep, and they're fighting against that. And they're fighting against it by activating the stress axis, and sustained activation of the stress axis, of course, is associated with all of those pathologies that we've touched on.
What about the COVID-19 situation? Are there any sort of disruptive elements in what we see now with the COVID-19 that can impose, push or push back the developments that we've heard and seen today? Marete?
Concerning COVID-19, we have an enormous opportunity to implement LED lighting that disinfect from bacteria and viruses. And what I will recommend everybody while staying at home is to open your window, because these important wavelengths that kill bacteria and viruses are part of daylight. And actually, we made a study a few years ago, published a study about the D vitamin, and accidentally found out that some of these wavelengths that are important for the production of D vitamin actually also turn out to be very effective for killing even resistant bacteria. So my recommendation, also in line with the recommendation by Marete, get a lot of daylight, because it's beneficial for you. I'm totally aware about the damage that you can do with UVC. And this should never be done in hospitals or kindergartens. And you really should take care. In order to benefit from these properties in light, you need always to use wavelengths and doses that are available in daylight.
Exactly.
Like 15 minutes exposure during a Danish summer.
Okay, thank you so much. And Professor Foster, you'll have the last word of today. I heard the other day a statistic of inner London. There's a 40% drop in commuters in inner London. Obviously, that has a tremendous consequence also. So your last comment, please.
Yes, well, I think people in the UK are pragmatists, and they're moving out of London and they're buying houses with gardens, embracing natural light.
Okay, thank you so much. I think my own, as I said, being a non-expert in this field, I think I have also a tremendous experience, feedback and learnings from today. If I should wrap it up on a personal note, it would be something like get outside as much as possible. Remember not to be stressed, and if you choose to go inside, then get some sleep. So I think that will be more or less my conclusion. But thank you so much. First and foremost, of course, Joachim Hansen, Poul Michael Petersen, Tord Winglin, and of course also Marete Madsen, and to you, of course, Professor Rotten Foster. Thank you so much for participating in this roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye.